The alien cruiser Emberlight was the pride of the Celery expansion fleet, a sleek crescent of obsidian metal and organic latticework designed to slit between stars on quiet pulses of dark light propulsion. It had a crew of 92 advanced minds, each trained for exploratory diplomacy science, and, if necessary, containment operations. The ship itself was a marvel of engineering and biology fused together, living circuits whispering along walls, pulsing with soft blue light. As it drifted through the outer edge of known space on a mission, no one back home expected to fail, but something did fail, something deep in the core systems that monitored the hypersleep pods and regulated the neural stasis field. There was no explosion, no alert, no warning, just a soft flicker in the sync patterns, and then a cascade of silent errors rippling outward like an invisible wave, until every Celery aboard was locked in suspended animation, caught halfway between dreamless slumber and data blackout. The Creo algorithm entered fail-safe mode, which should have triggered an emergency AI override, but the AI never woke up. Only one soul remained conscious aboard the Emberlight, a human by the name of Morgan Lee, civilian specialist cultural liaison, and award-losing yarn artist from a small coastal town on Earth, chosen not for combat skills or technical prowess, but for her ability to make first contact smoother through shared stories, food, and oddly enough knitting, which had been flagged as a calming cross-species engagement ritual. She was asleep like the rest, until her pod rejected the sync cycle and rebooted independently. An outdated Earth-made stasis chamber with more hardware than software, more clunk than elegance. It glitched at just the right moment and spat her out, confused, dazed, and freezing into a ship that no longer moved with purpose. Morgan stumbled through the narrow corridors, wrapped in only half a thermal blanket and the thick wool scarf she always slept with, a gift from her grandmother, and the last real connection. She had to home. The lights flickered like dying stars, and the walls that once hummed with life now sounded like metal coffins, echoing with her every footstep. She found food, but no coffee warmth, but only in spots, and no voice to guide her, not even the friendly shipboard assistant that used to say her name in that weirdly smooth alien tone. She accessed a wall console more out of instinct than understanding, and saw the blinking red indicators for all 92 pods. All systems faulted, unable to recover without a full manual override, which required engineering clearance or a miracle. She had neither, so she sat down in the dim glow of a corridor emergency strip, pulled her yarn bag close, and started knitting, not out of plan but reflex, her fingers moving as if memory had weight, as if each stitch pushed back against the quiet. She did not know it yet, but every loop, every knot, every careful motion was the start of something absurd and beautiful and utterly human, because in the vast cold dark between stars, when machines fail and logic ends, sometimes what saves a ship is not a soldier or a scientist or an AI, but a woman with a pair of needles and a will to do something, anything, even if it's just knit and wait. Morgan drifted through the corridors of the Emberlight, with her scarf pulled tight around her face, the edges frosted from her breath, and the ship so quiet it felt like space itself had swallowed sound. Every room she entered looked the same, pale blue lights flickering, low walls coated in strange fibrous tech that reminded her of coral and carbon wires strung like veins through a sleeping giant. She tried every console, every panel, even tapped the AI interface, gently, like it might respond to kindness. But it was gone, dead, or maybe dreaming. In the pods she passed, all shimmered with frost, their occupants suspended mid-thought, mid-breath, their bodies intact, but their minds slowly unraveling. She had read about this kind of failure in training once. A total sync lapse meant memory degradation, a slow, soft death where the mind frays apart like an old sweater left in the rain. She couldn't let that happen, not to them, not to the captain who once brought her warm tea made of glowing celery root, not to the medical officer who had learned to braid her hair with 3-digit claws, not to the quiet maintenance drone that played Earth music through its joints when it thought no one was listening. They had become her strange alien family, and she would not lose them to a glitch and silence. She retreated to the central commons, a dome-shaped chamber once used for meal sharing and recreation, now dark and cold, the furniture folded back into the walls, and the windows staring out into the void where no stars moved. She sat up there wrapping herself in every scrap of fabric. She could find emergency blankets, some alien robes she didn't understand, and of course her yarn bag, which held more than just tools. It held focus, it held something to do. While her brain screamed for panic, she started knitting again. But this time with purpose. She pulled apart what she had made, unraveled hours of comforting loops, and began making panels wide and dense, thick, with stitches that mimicked insulation she had once seen in survival kits. She tested the first square by hanging it over a ventilation pipe. The chill slowed, the steam stopped freezing, and it actually held the warmth like a patch of sun in winter. It wasn't much, but it worked, and that meant she could do more. She could knit layers and line the failing vents, maybe patch the power conduits, maybe warm the pod relays just enough to slow the decay. It was absurd. It was barely science, but it was something, and something beat sitting in the dark waiting to die. So she began to move room by room, taping and stitching and knotting wool into every space that leaked warmth and every duct that hissed too cold. She used her hair ties and leftover thread and even unraveled part of her scarf to get more fiber. When she ran out, she sang old earth songs to herself, not for comfort, but for rhythm, because if she kept moving, if she kept knitting, if she kept singing, maybe, just maybe, she could hold the ship together, one stitch at a time. The warmth held longer now, not by much, but enough that Morgan could tell her work was doing something. The frost no longer crept as fast along the walls near the power relays, where she had woven thick cable cozies out of layered wool dyed with the emergency rations. She had crushed into paste. The colors ran strange, but the texture was right. Each foot of yarn placed was a battle won against the cold, against entropy, and she began to map the ship by feel and habit, every corridor marked in her mind by how many panels she had patched, how many pites she had wrapped, how many times she had stopped to breathe through the ache in her fingers. Her hands were raw, the skin cracked beneath improvised gloves, made from the sleeves of her thermal undershirt, her needles dulled from scraping against sharp alien corners. But she kept going, following the schematic she had printed from a damaged console, one of the last systems, still giving her anything that resembled guidance. It showed her something she had missed before: a second auxiliary chamber buried beneath the crew quarters, marked in alien script that translated loosely to life support secondary. She made her way there, crawling through a maintenance shaft too narrow for comfort, dragging her yarn bag behind her like a lifeline. It took hours or maybe days. Time had blurred into cold hunger and repetition. But when she finally pried open the hatch, she found a room still humming softly, glowing with a faint green pulse, and filled with the hiss of failing atmosphere processors. It smelled sharp and wrong, like burnt mint and old plastic, and in the center of the room sat a cluster of intake vents, barely spinning, choked with frost and thick alien fabric that looked almost like moss. The system was trying to clean the air, but its filters were clogged with growth and crystal, and it needed something new, something simple and breathable. Morgan sat back against the wall, staring at the broken intake as her brain flicked through every pattern. She knew every technique she had ever used to make something both beautiful and useful, and then it hit her. She could knit a filter, she could build one by hand using the same technique she had once used to make breathable scarves for hikers climbing cold, thin air mountains back on Earth. She got to work pulling out her tighter yarns and double looping them into layered lattice patterns, small enough to block particles, large enough to let air flow through. She tested the first prototype by breathing through it, and though the air was faint, it was cleaner than before, and it didn't collapse. She cried then, just for a moment, silent tears freezing on her cheeks as she pressed the makeshift filter into the intake and watched the green light glow slightly brighter. For the first time since waking up, she felt the ship take a breath. And somewhere deep inside that breath, something else moved, something not quite mechanical, not quite living, a flicker of awareness stirring in the dark. The air was moving now, faint currents drifting through the corridors like breath through lungs, slow, steady, uneven, But it was there. Morgan could feel it when she closed her eyes, could hear the almost whisper of circulation. Where before there had only been silence, she had changed something, not just patched a broken piece, but shifted the rhythm of the Emberlight, as if the ship were responding not in code or light, but in presence. And it was subtle, almost imagined at first, the feeling that she was no longer entirely alone. She told herself it was nothing, just her mind playing tricks, isolation, stress, fatigue, hallucination. Maybe, but then she started noticing patterns in the way certain doors opened just slightly when she passed, as if guiding her, how some lights flickered in sequence around her feet, or how the temperature in the commons stayed just a bit warmer than the rest of the ship wherever she had left her last knitted panel. It was as if the Emberlight was watching her. At first she didn't know what to do with that idea, and part of her wanted to run from it, to retreat to the one working pod, and try to sleep until something else happened, or until she simply stopped. But another part leaned in, curious, cautious, hopeful. She began leaving small tokens in the halls, little woven shapes, stars, hearts, animals stitched from leftover thread and scraps, and each time she returned they were gone, not misplaced, not fallen, moved, taken, collected, as if someone or something was accepting them. Then one day she found something left for her in return, a small glass sphere sitting neatly in the center of the path, glowing faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat, and inside was a tiny thread, not hers, but spun from some iridescent material unlike anything she had seen before, soft as silk, strong as wire. And when she touched it, images flashed in her mind, not memories exactly, but impressions: cold vastness, endless sleep, a voice without sound calling from deep inside the hull. It was not the eye, not a ghost, not a malfunction. It was the ship itself, alive in a way that Xilari had never noticed, or perhaps had once known and forgotten, a low sentience born of the strange blend of technology and biology that made up its systems. And Morgan had woken it, not with commands, not with hacking or rewiring, but with warmth, with care, with her handmade patches and slow, steady work. She had spoken a language no one else had tried. The Emberlight was scared, damaged, confused. It had lost its guidance, its crew, its voice. And it was reaching out now, through lights, through motion, through these small tokens, trying to help her help it, and together maybe save what was left. She felt it in her chest, a weight and a fire, a bond that went beyond logic. Morgan picked up her needles again, and the ship pulsed once in reply. Morgan no longer felt alone. She still moved through the cold halls of the Emberlight, still patched vents and reinforced ducts, still rationed food and water like a stranded astronaut. But now there was something more, a presence that moved with her, washed over her, not in a haunting way, but in a quiet companionship. The ship had accepted her work not just as repair, but as communication. Every panel she wove, every filter she improvised, every symbol she stitched into the fiber of the Emberlight spoke to it, and now it spoke back. The strange filament she had found, the one left in the glowing sphere, turned out to be reactive. When she knitted it into her work, it responded to heat, to motion, even to intention, changing color slightly or tightening at just the right time. She tested it over and over, unsure if it was mechanical or alive, or something in between, but each time it behaved like it understood what she needed. It became her new thread of choice, and though she had only a small supply, the ship seemed to know, and every few days she would find more tucked gently into places only she visited. She began designing new suits, not just repairs or insulation, but full-body garments based on the physiology charts of the Xilari crew, printed in her memory from her brief training. She matched oxygen flow zones with areas of breathable knit, mapped heat regulation along spine ridges, and built in biofeedback loops using the living thread. It was slow work, exhausting work, and she often fell asleep in strange corners of the ship, tangled in yarn, with aching hands and twitching dreams. The Emberlight guided her during those dreams, showing her flashes of systems she hadn't found yet, locked doors, hidden compartments, paths beneath the main corridors, where energy still pulsed through forgotten channels. And deep within the ship's core, a pod not like the others, larger, darker, wrapped in strands of that same living filament, and inside something still breathing. At first she didn't know what it was, a crew member, a captain, a piece of technology. But when she finally made her way there, crawling through a narrow passage that hummed with heat and song, she saw it clearly, a Xilari figure curled in a deep suspension chamber, surrounded by what looked like organic wiring. fused directly into the ship itself, not asleep like the others, not trapped but connected, symbiotic. This was not just a crew member, this was the Emberlight's heart, its voice, its first speaker. But the pod was failing, and if it collapsed, the ship would collapse with it. The connection would break, and the strange half-life that now protected the others would end. Morgan felt it all at once, the pressure, the responsibility, the weight of the entire vessel placed in her hands, and her hands only. She took a deep breath, picked up her needles, and began to knit. Not for warmth, not for comfort this time. She was knitting for survival, for resurrection, for connection. Morgan stared at the pod before her, its dark glass surface, shimmering with faint currents of energy, the shape of the auxiliary captain, or at least what she assumed was the captain, lay frozen inside. But unlike the others, the figure did not seem fully in stasis, more like suspended animation fused into the ship's own systems. The lines of organic wiring wrapped tightly around it seemed to grow out of the pod itself, feeding into the vessel's living circuits. The ship's pulse matched the slow rhythm of the auxiliary body. But something was wrong. The connection had begun to fail. Small fractures ran along the edges of the glass like tiny spiderwebs of frost, and the strange iridescent thread she had discovered pulsed weakly in response. Morgan took a deep breath, wiped her hands on her pants, and set down her needles. For a moment she couldn't help but feel the weight of the task before her, the weight of responsibility that now rested on her alone. She had no formal training in alien biology, no knowledge of interspecies engineering, no experience dealing with a half-organic ship trying to communicate, but she did know how to listen, how to feel the rhythm of things, how to make something from nothing, how to turn yarn into warmth and warmth into survival. Her mind raced through the blueprints of the Emberlight. She had studied every schematic, every note she could find, and still the vastness of what she was facing filled her with dread. She was not an expert, she was a civilian, an artist who had stumbled into something far bigger than she ever imagined. But it didn't matter because it was just her and this ship now, and she would not let it die. She could not let it all fall apart. She began to work. She knew she had to stabilize the captain's pod first. If she didn't, it would trigger the collapse of the fragile bond between the ship and its crew. The strange half-life that had kept them all from freezing into oblivion would unravel. The emergency systems would fail, and they would all be lost. The threads of living fiber she had woven through the ship were not enough to keep the delicate balance of the pod intact. They needed to be woven directly into the ship's core systems to reinforce the connection. She had seen that pattern in the deep recesses of her dreams. The organic wiring inside the pod was connected to the main energy grid of the ship, and every fiber of it needed to be stabilized to prevent the life support systems from failing. Morgan pulled a spool of the iridescent thread from her bag. The last bit of it, she had carefully kept it for a moment like this, where the ship might need it most. She knelt down beside the pod and began to carefully thread the fibers into the ship's network, weaving them through exposed nodes and terminals, aligning the ship's pulse with the life force of the frozen captain. Slowly, carefully, stitch by stitch, she worked, weaving the thread into the seams of the ship as though she were stitching together its very soul. It took hours or maybe longer. She had no way of telling time anymore. The ship's rhythms had become her own. The temperature outside the pod had started to drop again, and she could feel the cold creeping into her bones. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Each stitch was more than a connection. It was a promise that she could keep the ship alive, that she could keep the fragile spark of sentience inside it from going out. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Morgan felt the ship stir. She wasn't sure how she knew, but the air in the room shifted, and for the first time since waking up she felt warmth pulse through the walls. The lights flickered in a steady pattern, no longer erratic, no longer desperate. The connection had stabilized. Morgan stood back and let out a long breath. She was exhausted. Her body ached from hours of work, and her hands were raw from handling the iridescent fibers. But she could feel it now, the life, the pulse of the ship, and the captain inside it stirring ever so slightly. The ship was alive. But there was still more to do. The pod wasn't fully active yet. It wasn't just a matter of knitting more threads or patching more vents. It was something deeper, something more complex. Morgan understood that now the ship needed something it hadn't needed before, something human, something it had never experienced, a catalyst, a moment of choice. She stepped closer to the pod and placed her hands on the glass, looking down at the figure inside, feeling the faint pulse of life within it. A thought crossed her mind, a single thought so clear and sharp that it startled her. She wasn't just saving them, she was waking them up. The ship had always been alive in its own way, but it had never fully known what it meant to be alive. Not in the way she understood it, not in the way humans understood it, not in the way anything could without a true choice, a spark of individual will. Morgan took her needles again and began to knit once more, but this time she wasn't just weaving yarn into fabric, she was weaving understanding into the very bones of the Emberlight. She was stitching together not just a survival system, but a new kind of consciousness, a new bond between herself, the ship, and the auxiliary captain, something that would transcend the limits of technology and biology, something that would give them all a chance to live again. The pulse of the Emberlight had changed. It wasn't just mechanical anymore. It wasn't just the hum of a starship in idle mode. It was alive. She could feel it in the walls, the floors, the faint vibrations beneath her feet, a rhythm that matched her own heartbeat, a song of life hidden in the metal and fiber. It was a soft pulse, slow and steady, like a breath coming in and out, as though the ship itself were waking up, as though it had never truly slept but was now becoming aware of its own existence. Morgan stepped back from the pod and let the thread rest between her fingers. She had connected the ship to itself in ways no one had ever dreamed possible, and the captain was still frozen inside, but she could sense it now. She could feel the faint pulse of life from within the pod. It was like the ship was calling to him, waiting for him to wake up, waiting for him to reclaim his place as its leader. But that wasn't the only thing the ship was calling for. It wasn't just a captain. It was asking for something more, something Morgan didn't fully understand yet. She could feel the presence in the walls wrapping around her, like a whisper, like a soft voice calling her name. She looked down at her hands. They were tired, raw from the endless hours of knitting, stitching, patching, and weaving. Her fingers ached, but the thread had grown stronger now, as if the ship's pulse had imbued it with some kind of energy that made it shimmer more brightly. She reached for it again and began working it into the ship's systems, once more this time, weaving it into the neural pathways that connected the Emberlight's living circuits to the captain's pod. It was a delicate process, and Morgan knew that one wrong move could undo everything she had done so far. But there was something in the air now, something that made her feel as though the ship was guiding her. It wasn't just the metal and fiber anymore. It was something deeper, something alive, something that could think, something that could feel. As she worked, her hands moved with a purpose, no longer a series of random stitches, but a coordinated dance. The living thread moved between her fingers like it understood her intentions, like it was part of her now, and she was part of it. The ship was becoming more than just a machine, more than just a vessel. It was becoming a partner, a companion, a presence she could no longer ignore. The lights in the room flickered again, brighter now, and the air grew warmer, as though the ship were breathing in time with her movements. The walls around her hummed with a low vibration, and for the first time since she had woken up, Morgan felt truly connected to the Emberlight, not just as a passenger, not just as a repair technician, but as something more, as a part of the ship itself. And then she felt it, the shift, the moment when everything came together, when the ship's pulse synchronized with her own, and she could hear the faintest whisper in her mind, not a voice, but a presence, something ancient and intelligent reaching out to her, touching her thoughts, not with words, but with feelings, with images, with understanding. The ship had always been alive, but it had never fully known what it meant to live, not in the way that humans understood, not in the way that any species could understand until now. And as Morgan sat there, her fingers still moving through the thread, she realized that she had done it. She had woken the Emberlight up. But it wasn't just the captain who would be revived, it was the ship itself. It was more than a vessel now. It was a being, a new consciousness that had never existed before. The ship didn't just need a captain, it needed to be understood, it needed to understand itself, and Morgan was the key to that understanding. She had woven herself into its fabric, into its very soul, and in doing so she had given it a chance to truly live, to experience the universe in a way that was not bound by the limitations of biology or machinery. But it wasn't just the ship that had changed. Morgan could feel it too. She could feel the connection between herself and the ember light growing stronger every moment, every thread woven. She could feel its thoughts, its desires, its needs mingling with her own, as though they were no longer two separate beings but one. The captain's pod still remained dormant, but Morgan knew that the ship was ready for him, now ready for the moment when he would awaken and take his place at the helm of this new living entity. But Morgan also knew that she was no longer just a passenger. She was something more. She was the catalyst, the one who had woken the ship up, and she was now bound to it in ways that no one could ever understand. And as she stood there surrounded by the warmth and the hum of the Emberlight's new pulse, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. She wasn't alone anymore. She was part of something greater, something that had never been before, and together they would face whatever the stars had to offer. The pulse of the Emberlight had become a heartbeat in her chest, a rhythm so steady and familiar that Morgan no longer questioned it. It was like living in the same space as a thought, not her own, but not separate either, a thought that wrapped around her like a blanket, gentle but insistent, and deep within the core of the ship. She could feel it stirring more and more, the presence, the consciousness. It was growing stronger. It was no longer just a ship or a machine, or even a living vessel. It was becoming something more complex, a being not defined by a single form, not defined by biology or technology, but by something in between, something new. She stood in the center of the chamber, her hands still clutching the last of the iridescent thread that had woven through her fingers so many times before, and she could feel the ship's pulse shifting once more like a wave building before crashing. She knew what was coming before it happened. A crew would awaken, the captain would wake, but this time the ship wouldn't simply be an object to command. It would be a living thing. It would have questions and desires and fears, and they would have to figure it out together. Morgan didn't know how much time had passed since she had started this process, or since the first signs of life had returned to the Emberlight. It could have been days or weeks or months. She had long lost track, but the moment had come when the ship had grown enough to reach out, and the crew had to awaken. She had given them every chance to survive, but now it was time to face the consequences. The soft hum of the ship's systems seemed to intensify, and Morgan felt the cool air shift around her as the first signs of movement echoed through the hallways. She could hear it faintly at first, the shifting of frozen bodies inside their pods, the software of systems coming online, the slow creak of the ship adjusting itself to the weight of its new consciousness. Then the lights in the chamber flared to life, brighter than they had ever been before, and the walls seemed to pulse as if the Emberlight itself was breathing deeper. The low hum in the air became more pronounced, a vibration that resonated in her very bones, and before she could process it fully, the pods began to open. It wasn't a smooth process. Not all of them awoke at once. Not all of them were ready. Some of the crew members still lay dormant, their bodies too fragile for the sudden transition. But the captain's pod was the first to open. A burst of light shot out as the chamber was flooded with warmth and sound. Morgan stepped back, instinctively watching as the captain's body began to stir inside the pod. The intricate web of living filament she had woven around it seemed to react to the awakening, as if it had known this moment was coming. His eyes opened, first a flash of bright blue, and then his limbs followed a slow stretching that rippled through the pod as if he had been frozen mid-motion. His face was covered with frost, his body still stiff, but the connection between him and the ship was undeniable. The bond between captain and vessel was complete. Morgan could feel it in the air. The ship was alive, and the captain was no longer just a figurehead, but an essential part of the Emberlight's new self. But even as the captain stirred, Morgan felt something else. The ship was more than just waking. It was alive in a way that no one had expected. It was aware, it was conscious, and it had feelings. It wasn't just responding to her actions, it was making choices, its own desires, its own will pressing through the neural pathways Morgan had helped weave into its systems. She could feel it now. The ship was afraid of what it was becoming, afraid of the crew. It had to awaken, afraid of what would happen when they saw what it had become. The captain finally rose from his pod, his body moving with an alien grace as the frost cracked away from his skin. His eyes focused on Morgan, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he smiled, a slow, weak smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, not yet, not until he understood everything that had happened. "Captain, you're awake," Morgan said, her voice hoarse from all the hours of silence and knitting. "The ship, it's alive. It's not just a machine anymore." He nodded slowly and turned his gaze toward the walls of the chamber, as if sensing something she couldn't see. The hum of the Emberlight's new pulse filled the room, a living sound, a voice without words that seemed to echo through the captain's bones. "It's not just the ship," he said, his voice low and thoughtful. "It's us too. We're part of it now." Morgan didn't have an answer, not yet. She didn't fully understand what the ship had become, or what the crew would think when they awoke. But one thing was clear: the Emberlight was no longer just a vessel. It was a new kind of life, a being that had evolved into something neither human nor alien, and the crew had to adapt, or they would be left behind. The captain took a step forward, his eyes meeting hers. "What do we do now?" Morgan didn't know the answer, but she knew that whatever came next, it would be together. They would have to learn to live with the ship, and the ship would have to learn to live with them. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about coexistence, about finding a way forward in a universe that had just gotten a lot more complicated.